Hello and welcome to an Envato Tuts Plus tutorial. I'm Adi Purdila, and today we're going to create some pretty awesome patterns with a tool called CSS Doodle. I've been playing around with it lately and it's a pretty amazing tool. In this tutorial we're going to learn the basics and also create 4 patterns. So let's get started with the installation. To install, go to cssdoodle.com. And this is the official website. You're going to find code examples here and also some of the things that you can create with CSS Doodle. Now, down here on the Getting Started section, you'll find a link to the JavaScript library you need to load. So let's go ahead and copy that. I'm going to jump over to CodePen. This is where I will be working. I'm going to go into Settings, JavaScript. And I'm simply going to add, that library here and hit close. So this is the same as just loading that file in the head of your document. With CodePen, it's much simpler. Now, we don't actually need to write any JavaScript code or any CSS code for that matter. Everything is done inside the HTML section. So let's start with demo 1, and I'm going to walk you through the syntax as we're building these examples. First, you got to create an element called CSS-Doodle. So CSS-Doodle, this is a custom element, and this is targeted by the JavaScript library. And based on the contents of this element, the patterns will be generated right here. First, we start with the Doodle selector. So we say Doodle, and with this we can target the actual element, the actual pattern in its entirety. The next step is to define a grid, and you can define a grid inside the Doodle selector or as a data attribute on the CSS Doodle element. So if you say grid equals 5, we're going to have a 5 by 5 grid. Now, to show you that grid, I'm going to do the following. I'm going to say background color, or simply background is enough. Let's say 26 C6DA. So now we're starting to see something. The second way of adding a grid is by using the grid property. And you would do this at grid, let's say 5 by 5. This is a notation that you can use. Let's add a grid size. Size, this is another property. I don't know, let's say 10 rems. Okay, so now we're starting to get somewhere. Let's also add a grid gap. Let's say 1 pixel. And by doing that, you can now see the grid more clearly. We have 5 by 5, and the total size of my grid is 10 rems. Now I can also specify a fixed number here, like 20, and this will create 20 cells in this direction, 20 cells in this direction. I can do 20 by 10. So now I'm going to have 20 cells in this direction and 10 in this direction. So if you want a square grid, you just stick with a single number. You can also use a single notation for this. Instead of using grid and size, you can say grid 20, which is the number of cells, and then you would put in the size, 10 rems, and the effect will be exactly the same. Now, instead of rems, you could use any kind of unit, either pixels, ems, percentage, VMax, Vmin. So for example, if we were to say 100 VMax, that's going to fill in my canvas, and you can now see the grid more clearly. So let's try and build a pattern with this so you can actually see the power of a CSS Doodle. Everything you see here inside the Doodle selector refers to the entire pattern. Everything you see here or outside the selector refers to each individual grid cell. Okay? So, if for example, I were to say transform scale 0.9 every single item in my grid will be scaled to 0.9 or to 90%. But if I do the following, @rand, and this means random, this will scale each grid cell by a random number, as you can see here. But I can also specify a range. So let's say I want to scale from, I don't know, 0.1 to 0.9. That's going to choose a random number between 0.1 and 0.9 and apply that to the scale. That's pretty cool, right? So what else can we do? Well, because this is applied individually to each grid cell, let's make things a little bit more interesting and add maybe, let's say, a translate 3D. And let's do another random value with a minimum of 50 pixels for the X, random minimum of 100 pixels for Y, and 0 for our third axis. And I accidentally mistyped this. Okay, so now we have two transformations. We have a scale and we have a translate 3D, which basically positions each grid cell a specific amount to the side or to the top or bottom using a translate 3D. Now, what about colors? What if you want to create different colors? Well, that can easily be done. Because this is recursive, so we're going through each grid cell, we can use random values for colors in the HSL format. So we can say background, and this will overwrite our initial background. We can say HSL A. So HSL, if you're not familiar, is hue, saturation, lightness. A stands for alpha, so that's the level of the opacity. So we can say, let's do a random of 360. So a maximum of 360. I think I made a mistake earlier when I said this is the minimum. This is the maximum. Okay, so it gives you a random number that's no greater than, in our case, 50 pixels or 100 pixels here. So random of 360 for the hue, and then for saturation, it's really up to you. Let's say an 85% saturation. And then lightness. Let's also do a random. By the way, @r is an alias or a shortcut for @rand. So let's do the lightness between 70% and 90%. And now we're starting to get somewhere. And for the alpha, let's also do a random up to 0.9. Okay, so now we have for each individual cell, we have a different color with a different hue, the same saturation, a different lightness, and a different alpha. So that's starting to look pretty cool. We can also do a random border radius. So border radius @r, maximum of 10 pixels. Okay, so that's going to apply a different border radius for every single one of these. So now let's say I want to scatter these a little bit more and also make them a little bit smaller. Well, you can do that from here by changing the grid gap. Right now I have it set at 1 pixel, but I can set it, for example, at, I don't know, 50 pixels. All right, but that might be a little bit too much, so maybe 20 pixels. So now you're starting to see where we're going at. Or you can use the same VMax unit, and let's say 4 VMax. Okay, so that gives us our pattern. If you don't know the VMax measurement, that's from CSS actually. It has nothing to do with CSS Doodle. 1 VMax is actually 1/100th of the biggest side, so either horizontal or vertical. So 4 VMax is actually 4/100ths of the biggest side. But as I said, you can use any kind of measurement unit. For me, VMax works just fine right now. So here is our pattern. As you can see, it scrolls up and down because it's not actually set as a background, but we can easily do that. Let's go ahead and give this a class of Doodle, and you can go into CSS, you can target Doodle, and you can set its position to fixed, and you can set a z-index to -1, so it sits below everything else on the page. Okay, so now as you can see, it doesn't scroll anymore, and I can even go ahead and add our page content. So let's say container page content, and inside CSS we can say container, I don't know, let's give it a width 75%, let's make it white, let's give it a margin, let's give it a padding, and let's give it a box shadow, say something like this, black 0.2%. Okay, so here it is. This is our page content on top of our pattern that sits in the background. And you saw just how easy it was to create this. You basically define the properties of your pattern, like the grid, the number of grid cells, and the overall size of your grid gap if you want one, of course, and then for each individual grid cell you define its properties. And you can use certain properties that are specific to CSS Doodle, like random, to create these dynamic properties for the individual cells. So what else can we do with Doodle? Well, we can do a lot of things. Let's actually delete this, reset it, so we can create another pattern. And I'm actually gonna delete that property. Let's start this time with a grid, let's say 10. Again, 100 VMax. I'm just doing this for demo purposes. So I'm gonna fill the entire viewport with the pattern. Grid gap 4 VMax, that should be fine. And let's do a background here. Let's say B2 DF DB. And this background color is applied to the entire pattern, not just each individual cell. Now for each individual cell, let's start with this transform, scale, and we'll do a random from 0.1 to, let's say, 1.9, and let's stick with that. Let's add some background colors. So background color, or simply background, you can go with that. HSLA, we'll use the same color format because it allows us to generate random colors. So the hue, random 100, let's say 85%. For lightness, let's do another random from 90% to 100%. Now we're starting to get somewhere. And also a random value up to 0.9 for the opacity. Okay, so now we have this pattern. Nothing really that different from what we've seen before. Now here's the cool part. With CSS Doodle, we have access to specific shapes. And we can find all the shapes down below where it says basic shapes. We can add circles, triangles, rhombus, pentagon, cross, all of these. So here's how a circle would look like. You would go in here and you would say shape, circle. So now we won't have squares, which are the default, but we'll have circles instead. So what other shapes do we have? Stars. We can add star. So now we have stars. But let's go with something a little bit more interesting, which is this clover. So clover 5. So you would say this, clover 5. Right now, everything is still kind of displayed in a grid. So let's go ahead and fix that. Let's add some more transforms. So I'm going to say translate 3D. And we're going to say a random of 150 pixels for the X. And a random of 200 pixels for the Y, 0 for Z. And then let's also do a rotate. Now let's do a random of 360 degrees. So each and every one of these is going to be rotated to 360. And that's what you get basically. For each individual clover shape, we're going to apply a scale, a random translate 3D, and a random rotate. So right now you're getting this. On another refresh, you're getting a completely different pattern. Same goes for color. We're generating random colors for each shape. And you can really easily tweak like how bright or how subdued the color is by changing these values. Let's look at another demo, one that this time uses animations. I'm gonna delete these, and I'm gonna delete these. And we'll start with a simple grid, 10 cells, 100 VMax. And then for each individual grid cell, I'm going to say background, and I'm going to use another function here called pick. And pick will randomly choose a value from a given list. In my case, I just added a list of some hex colors. And as you can see, we have a random color selected for each one. And also for each one, let's set the opacity to a random of maximum 90%. Now, because we're working with CSS here, we can do pretty much anything we can do in CSS, and that includes creating clip paths. So I can say clip path, and I can set a polygon. Okay, in that polygon, let's say I want to create a triangle, but I'm going to create a triangle that's different for each individual cell. So the first point is going to be a random of 50% and 0. The second point will be 50% and random, let's say 70%. And the third point will be 0 and a random of 100%. So with this, we apply a clip path to each individual cell, and that clip path is a polygon whose points are generated randomly based on this code here. And as you can see, all of these are different. So now what we can do is we can animate them. So I'm going to say animation. Remember, this is all the code that we write here is applied to every single item on our canvas. So I'm going to say animation, and let's just say test infinite, and let's do a duration random between 100 seconds and 150 seconds. And also, let's make the easing linear. Okay? Next, all we have to do is define our animations. So keyframes, test, at 0. We start with a transform, translate 3D. We'll make sure everything is right down to 0. And then at 50%, we're going to change the transform. We're going to say for the X, let's do a random up until minus 500%, or between minus 500 and 1000%. And this will make sure, here you can actually see these moving already. I need to make sure that my animation is not short, right? This element, for example, doesn't go just from here to here and then back. I want them to move way outside of my canvas, so we have this perpetual motion in the background. Okay, so we have the translate here. Let's also do the exact same thing for the y-axis, minus 500%, 1500%, and we'll leave that as it is. And then finally, at 100%, I want everything to move right back down. So here it is. We now have an animated background that's generated basically entirely out of CSS. Now for our last example, I'm going to show you a very cool effect that you can achieve with very little code. So let's start with a grid. That's 25 and 100 VMax as the size. And we're going to define a variable called hue. And for starters, I'm just going to say 100. So then for each individual item, I'm going to say background HSLA. I'm going to use my hue variable here for my hue. And then for saturation, let's say 50%, 70% for lightness, and let's do a random of 0.1 to 0.9 for the opacity. So now we get this kind of maze going on here. Now let's do another clip path. This time we'll do an ellipse and we'll say 100%, 100% at, and we'll say this pick, and we'll give it a list of values. And it's going to go like this: 0, 0. Next one is 0, 100%. Next is 100% and 0. And finally we have 100%, 100%. So what this is doing, it's creating an ellipse with the starting point in one of the four corners of my grid cell. So for example, this ellipse starts here, this one starts here, this one starts here, bottom left, and let's see, this one starts here at the bottom right. So now let's do a gradient starting from the top and going to the bottom. And this is where the power of CSS Doodle comes in, because we can use certain functions that will return the number of the row and the number of the column of the item we're currently styling. So if in here I'm going to say at row, all of these items in the first row will have the hue of 1. These will have the hue of 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on and so forth. But let's do something a little bit different. I'm going to say calc 100 plus 0.5 times row times col. So by doing that, we achieve our gradient. We start from here to green when we go all the way down to purple. And you can see the gradient. So how is this happening? Well, let's do a simple calculation. On the first item, we have row 1, column 1. So the result here is 0.5. So we're going to have 100.5. On this one, it's row 1, col 2. So we're going to have 0.5 times 2, which is 1. So this will have the hue of 101. But so will this. This one here will be row 2, column 2. So we're going to have 2 times 2, that's 4, times 0.5, that's 2, plus 100, that's 102. So the hue systematically increases as we go further down the grid. And if I remove my position fixed here, so we can actually see the whole grid, you can see that the gradient goes all the way down here. I think that's a super cool effect, and you saw just how easy it was to create it. And those are just some of the things you can create with CSS Doodle. You know the saying, the sky is the limit? Well, in this case, CSS is the limit, because you can go as far as CSS can take you. Linked down below, you'll find a CodePen collection containing all of these demos that we made here today, as well as a link to a CodePen collection from the author of CSS Doodle. He has some other types of patterns created there with radial gradients. It's a really cool thing to see. Also, I linked the website of the author, and you can check out his website and his social media. He also posts links to other types of work using CSS Doodle. I especially like the Unicode patterns he created. They're really something special. You should definitely check them out. And that's it for me. Thank you very much for watching this tutorial. I'm Adi, and until next time, take care.